I found out the homeowners association had built their brand new headquarters on my ranch the same way a man finds out somebody backed a truck into his barn by stumbling onto the mess long after the damage was done. It was just after sunrise, one of those cool mornings where the air still smells like dew and fresh dirt. I was riding along the eastern fence line of my property outside a little town I'll call Red Hollow, coffee in one hand, reins in the other, checking gates and making sure nothing had broken during the night. I've been doing that route for years, probably thousands of times, so when something changes out there, I notice it fast. That's why I nearly dropped my coffee when I crested a small hill and saw a 2-story office building sitting right in the middle of my grazing land. At first, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. The building had huge glass windows, fresh gray siding, decorative landscaping, and a giant stone monument sign out front that read Cedar Ridge Community Association Administrative Center. I honestly thought I had somehow wandered onto somebody else's property. Then I looked behind the building and saw the old oak tree my grandfather planted sometime in the 1950s. Same tree where we tied horses during branding season. Same tree I used to climb as a kid. Same tree that had stood on our family land for generations. That was the moment my stomach dropped. The office wasn't next to my property. It wasn't near my property. It was on my property, right where our cattle used to graze, right where my grandfather used to tell stories while sitting on an overturned feed bucket. Somebody had bulldozed part of my pasture, paved a parking lot, poured concrete foundations, run utility lines, and constructed an entire office complex without ever asking permission. No phone call, no letter, no survey meeting, nothing. Now, to understand why that mattered, you need to know a little about Cedar Ridge. About 6 years earlier, a luxury subdivision started expanding right up against my ranch. Nice houses, expensive trucks, perfectly trimmed lawns, and residents who seemed genuinely offended by things like dust, livestock, and country living. From the very beginning, the HOA board viewed my ranch as an obstacle. They wanted uniformity. They wanted expansion opportunities. Most of all, they wanted control. Over the years, they approached me multiple times trying to buy pieces of my land. The first offer was polite. I declined. The second offer was larger. I declined again. Then came real estate consultants explaining how development would improve the area. Then came letters suggesting my cattle operation negatively affected nearby property values. Then came subtle threats disguised as concerns. Every single time, I told them the same thing. No, the ranch wasn't for sale. My family had protected that land for decades, and I wasn't interested in cashing out because a group of suburban planners wanted prettier maps. Apparently somebody on that board decided my answer wasn't acceptable. I rode straight toward the building, tied my horse to a shiny metal railing near the entrance, and walked inside. The place was fully operational. Employees sat behind desks. Phones were ringing. People were typing reports. A receptionist looked up and smiled. "Good morning, sir. Can I help you?" she asked. I smiled right back and said, "Yeah, you can explain why everybody in this building is currently sitting on my ranch." The smile disappeared immediately. You could almost hear the confusion spreading through the room. Employees started looking at each other. A few stopped typing. Somebody quietly walked into a back office. Less than 5 minutes later, a man in an expensive suit emerged. Perfect haircut, perfect teeth, perfect fake confidence. He introduced himself as the HOA president. Let's call him Randall Pierce. Randall gave me the kind of smile people use when they're trying to calm down a dangerous dog. He assured me there had to be some misunderstanding. According to him, the association had legally acquired the parcel during a recent expansion project. He spoke slowly, confidently, like he had rehearsed the explanation. The funny thing was, the harder he tried to sound certain, the more suspicious I became. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anybody. I simply nodded, thanked him for his time, and walked out. Randall looked relieved, probably thinking he had brushed off another annoying landowner. What he didn't realize was that I already knew something wasn't right. And when I got home that afternoon, I pulled every document I owned out of my filing cabinet. Property deeds, county surveys, tax records, historical plats, everything. By sunset, I had my answer. The office building wasn't partially on my property. It wasn't close to the boundary. It was sitting approximately 60 feet inside my property line. Every document confirmed it. Every survey matched. The land had belonged to my family the entire time. Somewhere along the way, Cedar Ridge had relied on an outdated mapping file that failed to include a boundary correction recorded years earlier. They never verified the updated records. They never commissioned a proper survey. They never double-checked before pouring millions of dollars into construction. In other words, they made the kind of mistake that only happens when people become so convinced of their own authority that they stop asking whether they actually have any. I sat there looking at those documents, listening to the evening wind outside, and realized something. I could call a lawyer first thing in the morning. I could probably get an injunction. I could make their lives miserable immediately. But another idea had already started forming in my head, and it was going to be a lot more memorable. Now, before I tell you what I did next, let me explain something, because this is where a lot of people misunderstand how situations like this happen. According to standard procedure, any major construction project is supposed to involve surveys, title verification, permits, and multiple layers of review before concrete ever touches the ground. That's not bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy. That's protection against exactly this kind of disaster. From a legal perspective, owning a building and owning the land underneath it are two very different things. You can spend millions constructing something beautiful, but if it's sitting on someone else's property, you're standing on very thin ice. What's even more interesting is the psychology behind it. This is a psychological trap that affects organizations all the time. When a group gains enough authority, enough money, and enough public support, people inside that group start assuming they're correct before they verify the facts. Nobody wants to be the person asking uncomfortable questions. Nobody wants to slow down the project. So shortcuts get taken, assumptions get accepted, and eventually somebody builds a headquarters 60 feet into a cattle ranch. The lesson here is that confidence and ownership are not the same thing, and Cedar Ridge was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The next morning, I drove into the county office, carrying a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. I wasn't there to start a lawsuit, at least not yet. I wanted to understand every option available before making a move. After a couple conversations and more paperwork than any sane person enjoys filling out, I learned something interesting. Since the office building sat entirely within a legally documented portion of my ranch, I was still entitled to use the surrounding land however I wanted, provided I followed local regulations. That little detail became the foundation of a plan that made me smile all the way home. Most people expected a court battle. Most people expected angry letters and expensive attorneys. What nobody expected was a rancher with patience and a sense of humor. 3 days later, trucks started arriving. Workers unloaded fence posts, lumber, gates, and equipment. Construction crews began installing a large containment fence around the section of pasture surrounding the HOA headquarters. At first, nobody from Cedar Ridge seemed concerned. They probably assumed I was improving ranch infrastructure. After all, farmers build fences all the time. But as the days passed, the shape became impossible to ignore. The fence wasn't surrounding a field. The fence was surrounding their office. By Friday afternoon, a tall wooden perimeter enclosed the entire property. There was only one gate leading in and out. Hanging on that gate was a professionally printed sign that read, "Private Ranch Property Livestock Containment Area." The following Monday, I introduced the final piece of the project, 42 head of cattle. If you've never spent time around cattle, let me explain something. They're wonderful animals. They're also large, curious, noisy, muddy, and completely indifferent to corporate image management. Within hours, the office complex looked less like a professional administrative center and more like an accidental exhibit at a county fair. I sat on horseback from a nearby ridge watching employees arrive for work. The first woman parked her car, stepped out, looked at the herd surrounding the building, and simply froze. Another employee tried to walk through confidently until a curious steer wandered over to investigate him. He immediately changed direction. By lunch, the HOA office group chat must have been exploding. By the end of the day, I received my first phone call. It was Randall. He sounded significantly less confident than during our first meeting. "What exactly are you doing?" he demanded. I told him the truth. "Running a cattle operation on my ranch. You're intentionally interfering with our business." "Oh, yeah." "You intentionally built your business in the middle of my cattle operation." There was a long silence. Then he hung up. The next few days were magnificent. Employees complained about mud. They complained about odors. They complained about noise. One staff member reportedly refused to leave her vehicle until another employee escorted her through the herd. Every complaint eventually found its way back to me. Every time I gave the same answer. The cattle were lawfully contained. The fencing met requirements. The land belonged to me. Nothing I was doing violated any regulation. The truly beautiful part was that I wasn't forcing them to stay. They could leave anytime. They simply didn't want to admit they had created the problem themselves. Then homeowners started noticing. Cedar Ridge residents had invested serious money into their neighborhood. Many assumed the HOA board operated professionally. Suddenly photographs started appearing online. Residents drove past and saw their administrative headquarters surrounded by livestock. Videos circulated showing board members tiptoeing through muddy pasture while carrying briefcases. One clip showed a director attempting to maintain dignity while a cow licked the side of his luxury SUV. The internet, as you can imagine, was not kind. Questions started spreading through the community. Why was the office on ranch land? Did the board secure proper approvals? Who authorized construction? How much money had been spent? Why was nobody informed? Once homeowners started asking questions, the board's real nightmare began. See, angry ranchers are manageable. Angry residents who pay HOA fees every month are not. Within a week, rumors were everywhere. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Attendance exploded. Residents demanded records. Some wanted audits. Others wanted resignations. The board tried controlling the narrative by claiming there was a minor boundary dispute. Unfortunately for them, public records are difficult to argue with. Several homeowners independently reviewed county documents and discovered exactly what I already knew. The office wasn't involved in a small dispute. The building sat firmly on private ranch property. At that point, Randall requested a formal meeting. We met inside a local restaurant. He arrived carrying folders, maps, and what looked like several sleepless nights. Gone was the polished executive from our first encounter. This version looked tired, stressed, cornered. He opened with a purchase offer. It was substantially larger than any previous proposal. I listened politely and declined. Then he increased the number. I declined again. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and asked what I actually wanted. That was the easiest question he'd asked all day. I wanted accountability. I wanted restoration. I wanted people who ignored property rights to experience consequences. Randall argued that mistakes happen. I agreed. They do. Then I reminded him that mistakes usually get corrected when they're discovered. His board hadn't corrected anything. They had doubled down. They had assumed authority would protect them from responsibility. That's when I presented my terms. Option 1. Remove the building entirely. Restore the land to its original condition. Compensate for damages and cover associated costs. Option 2. Continue operating inside a cattle pasture indefinitely while facing growing homeowner outrage and inevitable legal exposure. Randall stared at me for several seconds. He knew the answer before the conversation ended. The board met 2 days later. 3 days after that, demolition permits appeared. When I saw the first heavy equipment arrive, I'll admit I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Not because I felt bad for the board. I didn't. But because so much waste could have been avoided if somebody had simply respected a property line. Workers began dismantling the structure piece by piece. Glass disappeared first, then interior walls, then roofing. Excavators eventually moved in and reduced the remaining shell to debris. Every day, more of the office vanished. Homeowners watched. Employees watched. Board members watched. Nobody celebrated. It wasn't that kind of victory. It was a public lesson unfolding in real time. 1 week later, the headquarters was gone. Utility lines were removed. Concrete was broken apart and hauled away. Soil remediation crews arrived. Fresh topsoil was spread. Grass seed was planted. The pasture slowly began reclaiming itself. A few weeks after that, standing near my grandfather's oak tree, you could barely tell a building had ever been there. The parking lot was gone. The landscaping was gone. The fancy sign was gone. The illusion of ownership was gone. The only thing left was open ranch land stretching beneath the morning sun exactly the way it should have been from the beginning. Before removing the final fence section, I installed one permanent marker near the property line. Nothing flashy, nothing aggressive, just a simple sign mounted to a sturdy wooden post. Private ranch property. Then I rode away and left it there. Not because I needed the reminder, because sometimes other people do. A few months after everything was over, life on the ranch looked pretty much the way it always had. The cattle grazed where the office building once stood. The wind moved through the grass the same way it had when I was a kid, and my grandfather's old oak tree still cast its shadow across the pasture every evening. If you drove past the property, you'd never know that an entire corporate-style headquarters had existed there for a brief period of time. Nature has a funny way of erasing human arrogance when given enough opportunity. Every now and then somebody asks me whether the whole thing was worth it. They ask if I should have just taken the money. They ask if I enjoyed embarrassing the HOA. The honest answer is more complicated than people expect. It was never really about revenge. Sure, I'll admit there were moments that made me laugh, especially watching people in expensive business clothes trying to navigate a herd of curious cattle before their morning meetings. But underneath, all the humor was something much bigger. Land ownership only means something if boundaries actually matter. The moment powerful organizations decide they can ignore those boundaries because they have more money, more influence, or more confidence, the entire system starts breaking down. That's why this story resonates with so many people. Most of us have experienced some version of it. Maybe not with land and cattle, but with someone who believed the rules applied to everybody except themselves. Someone who assumed authority automatically made them right. Someone who mistook confidence for competence. This is a psychological trap that shows up everywhere. Businesses fall into it. Governments fall into it. Neighborhood associations fall into it. Individuals fall into it. The more success people experience, the easier it becomes to stop questioning their assumptions. Eventually they stop asking, "Are we right?" and start asking, "How do we move forward?" The problem is that reality doesn't care how confident you are. Property lines don't care. County records don't care. Facts don't care. According to standard procedure, verification comes before action for a reason. When people skip that step, consequences usually arrive sooner or later. From a legal perspective, what happened out there was actually pretty simple. Ownership remained ownership regardless of how much money had been spent on construction. The expensive building didn't magically erase decades of recorded property history. What made the situation unusual wasn't the law. It was the mindset that allowed the mistake to happen in the first place. The lesson here is that respect for boundaries, both legal and personal, saves people from a tremendous amount of trouble. Had someone on that board taken one extra afternoon to review updated records, none of this would have happened. No domination, no public embarrassment, no financial losses, no cattle standing outside executive offices. Just a simple verification process preventing a very expensive mistake. Sometimes I think about Randall and the rest of the board. I don't hate them. Honestly, I suspect they learned a lesson they'll never forget. Most people do when a mistake costs that much money and attracts that much attention. Hopefully the next time they're making an important decision, somebody in the room will raise a hand and ask one more question before moving forward. If that happens, maybe the experience wasn't entirely wasted. As for me, I still ride that same fence line most mornings. I still stop near the oak tree from time to time. And every now and then I glance over at that little property sign and smile. Not because I won, not because they lost, but because the land is still where it's supposed to be, and sometimes that's enough. Now I'm curious what you think. If you discovered an organization had accidentally built a major facility on your property, would you have gone straight to court, accepted a settlement, or handled it the way I did? Let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling opinions on this one are going to be all over the place.